From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Bilal Qureshi. I'm a producer and editor with All Things Considered, and it's an honor here to welcome you to the International Pavilion at the National Book Festival, especially to have this wonderful opportunity to speak with Juan Gabriel Vásquez, who you've all, I'm sure, you're familiar with and are excited to hear as well. I wanted to just mention that, as you already know, this is the 15th anniversary of the National Book Festival. It's great for me to be part of an NPR delegation of hosts and reporters who are here doing interviews, and especially I think to be here in the International Pavilion, because my own passion and interest is in certainly in getting a chance for us as Americans to understand a little bit more the world around us through the arts. And there couldn't be a more appropriate pavilion for a conversation with a truly global writer, award-winning, acclaimed, and arguably one of the most important literary voices in Latin America today, and for someone still so early in their career. I just want to tell you a little bit about Mr. Vásquez's sort of biography. He began his career as a law student, and then in Bogota, and then this was obviously during the Colombian drug war. And as in that novel, he confronts in his writing so much of the painful history of his characters and his country. And he left Colombia, is it almost 2 decades ago? Is that accurate?
In 96.
In 96, okay. And then moved to Paris with stints in Belgium and a longer stay in Barcelona, and has recently moved back to Bogota, where he's now based. So welcome to Washington.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
And I want to begin with the new collection that has been published here in the US this summer, which is Lovers and All Saints Day by Riverhead. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this collection because it was actually originally published in Spanish in 2001. So can you tell us about where you were in your life at that time and a little bit about this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for doing this, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here in Washington again for the second time in less than a year, I think, which is great for me. I was in a terrible place in my life when I wrote that book. From a professional point of view, I had just published my second novel, which you won't find in my biography because I hate it, as I do the first. So in 1999, I had published 2 novels. I had already decided that they were not worth the time of any reader, and that it had been a complete mistake to publish them. They were good as training fields, but nothing else. They were the works of an apprentice, and I don't think I should have published those books. They were published just in Colombia. So I went into a sort of personal crisis with that, with the idea of what kind of writer I wanted to be. That got mixed up with a sort of personal fight I had with the city of Paris, which is a wonderful place to be when you are well, but it's a terrible place to be if you're not feeling good about what you're doing. So I went to spend a weekend with a couple of old friends in Belgium, in the Belgian Ardennes, in the Belgian mountains. They were an old couple. He is dead now. She is maybe 85 or 87. We had become very good friends. And they said to me, why don't you spend some days with us and figure out what you want to do with your life? I ended up staying for 9 months. So don't ever invite me to your place.
At their house? This was at their house for 9 months?
Yes, they had a big house in the middle of the woods. Their children had already left, married, had children of their own. And we were really very close. We enjoyed talking to each other. I have always enjoyed the company of older people. So they, for some reason beyond my understanding, they welcomed the idea to have me with them for such a long time. And as it turned out, those 9 months were among the most important in my life. I decided what kind of books I wanted to write. I didn't know how, but at least I knew what kind of books I wanted to write. I discovered that I wanted to marry my girlfriend and move to Barcelona and live in Barcelona and become the sort of writer I wanted to become in Barcelona. As soon as I got to Barcelona, this was at the very end of 1999, I started writing the book of stories, trying to put in literature, put in words, the things I had seen in Belgium, the things I remembered from the sad stories of people who confided me with their very intimate problems and problems of communication, love problems. So it turned out to be a book of sad love stories in which I learned many other things. I learned how to describe a scene in such a way that the reader will see it. A hunting scene, for instance, a fishing scene. I learned to describe mood, which is very important in short stories, to be able to convey a certain mood through setting and physical description. So I learned very valuable skills as a writer, writing the book, and on top of it, I discovered many things about human emotions, which is a good thing that will happen to you if you look at people closely.
And this is when you were living in Europe yourself personally, and so this was not a book that dealt with Latin America or was about Latin American characters per se.
No, of course. That was the other thing, that when I published that book in Colombia, people said, okay, this is very nice, but we have a civil war going on. We have a drug problem that has almost destroyed the country's democracy during the 90s. And you're writing about failed couples in the Belgian Ardennes. What is wrong with you?
Wasn't that a tough criticism to listen to, or?
Well, I wish I was able to write about Colombia at that time, but I wasn't. I discovered after this book, when I got this question so often, why don't you write about Colombia? I said, well, because I don't understand Colombia. I don't understand its history. I don't understand its politics. I don't understand this sort of violent temperament that has grown up with the country into 2 centuries of independent life. So, I'm sorry. So that was my answer. I don't understand it, therefore I cannot write about it. And it took me several years and the discovery of a couple of writers to realize that not understanding something is precisely the best reason to write about it. Because writing, for me, I discovered this too, writing is an act of discovery. Writing is an act of inquisition. Writing is asking questions, not giving answers. And when I realized that, then I went head-on to Colombian history and Colombian politics and the way they affect individual lives. And since then, I have written 3 novels, 4 novels now, around that subject.
And when you mentioned this idea of your novels being kind of more about discovery, I mean, this wasn't, writing about Colombia wasn't writing what you know for you. That idea that you hear in so many writing programs, write what you know.
Exactly.
It really was the opposite in a way, it seems.
The complete opposite. I have never put too much faith in that idea, that you should write about what you know. Well, that was a nice way to put it. No, I think it's silly. I think it's silly to form writing students around this idea, because the most interesting thing, the most fabulous thing you can do with literature is go to places where you have never been. This is what we do as novelists. This is what I do as a reader. As a reader, I want my favorite novelists to take me to places where I have never been before. Usually when that happens, it's because they, too, have never been to those places before. This is what Joseph Conrad, for instance, one of my favorite novelists, means when he says that the task of the writer is to go to places of darkness. The sentence, "An Area of Darkness," is the title of one of V.S. Naipaul's books too. This idea of novelists as people who go to dark places and come back with the news of what is going on there is one of the reasons I read and write.
Well, I'm interested in now talking about The Sound of Things Falling, which so many people read and learned about. This was sort of the grand book about Colombia and the drug wars in the 90s, and you did go ahead and write a book that directly confronts that period. What did you feel as you sort of finished your process of discovery and research and sat down to write it, that you were wanting to say about this period that people hadn't already known? Because it was being covered so much as a news story.
Yeah.
It was very much in front of us, but in a way you wanted to, as you said, shed light on it in a different light. Can you talk about what you wanted to do?
I think an obsession of mine has always been to try not to be redundant. That is, my friend Andres Neumann was discussing, thanks to a reader, was discussing Milan Kundera just before. There's a sentence in The Art of the Novel, a wonderful, beautiful essay by Milan Kundera, in which he says that the sole purpose of the novel, its reason for being, is to say things that cannot be said in any other way. Writing a novel to say something that could be said just as well with nonfiction or with a historical essay is for me a waste of time. I want to write books that say things that you can only find in those books. I'm sorry, I have this cold. That idea of trying to say things that you cannot find anywhere else was with me during the writing of The Sound of Things Falling. Because as a Colombian, I have grown up with this kind of information about the drug wars and the terrorism of the 80s. I know everything about them. I have seen the pictures of bombed buildings. Pablo Escobar bombed a commercial airline in 1989. And I have those images of the wrecked plane in the mountains of Colombia. I know more or less how many people died in each one of the big bombings. So I have the statistics, I have the images, but there was no place which I could visit to learn about the invisible side, to learn about what those years did to us from an emotional point of view, from a moral point of view. There was no place I could go to find out how growing up during those years changed the way we behaved as husbands or wives or children or parents. And I thought this is one of the best reasons I could have to write this book, to build this place where people can go and try to find out from an emotional, moral point of view what it's like to go through a period like that.
And how constructive was the exercise in the Belgian countryside and your observation of couples and relationships to constructing that kind of fabric for this book?
Well, I had never thought about that. Well, I guess it was pretty useful. The book of stories taught me many things about human relationships, and it's in a way it's obsessed, this book of stories, with the idea that there are small movements in our emotions when we love somebody, when we're about to lose somebody, when we have a conflict with our father or whatever. There are small movements of the sensibility that are a little too big for poetry, maybe, but are not big enough for a novel. So if the short story as a form didn't exist, they would go away, these moments, and we would be poorer for it. The short story is a great invention to capture those little things that go on in our soul, for lack of a better word. Those little movements of our sensibility, little moments when we understand something very important but very tiny about what it means to be in a relationship or to love or to lose somebody. And the book, all the 7 stories of the book, try to capture that moment, try to make it stay, so that maybe readers can go to the stories and say, hey, I knew this, but I didn't know I knew it, which is one of the great things literature does.
I want to ask you sort of the elephant in the room question as a Colombian novelist about...
Yes, I know what question is that.
You know, but it's a question...
Okay, so Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Right. No, yes. I wasn't going to put it as pointedly, but no, the question sort of about your literary style, I mean, and how you, in the discovery process of sort of the things that you wanted to write about, the way you wanted to write. And you've talked about him, and you've talked about the novel, and how, in fact, it was a big inspiration for you.
Yes.
As a form of saying, this is not what I want to write.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I wrote a whole essay about this when I started realizing that my questions, my answers to this question began turning more and more complicated and tiresome.
When you have some digs, you know, you have some references to them in your novel as well. I mean, you know, it's something that is in the air.
Yeah, but you know, it has been pointed out to me that there's a character in The Sound of Things Falling who hates 100 Years of Solitude.
Right.
I don't agree with her.
Okay, great.
It was fun writing that scene, but I don't agree with her. I think the whole misunderstanding comes from the idea that literary influence is territorial. That means that if you are born within the borders of Colombia, then the influence of Garcia Marquez falls on you. Like, not like an influence is what I wrote once, but like influenza. It's a contagious, unavoidable thing. It is not. Maybe I have a little bit of that, but...
The influenza here.
Yeah. Garcia Marquez discovered a new way of exploring the world. This is what we now call magical realism, which has created some misunderstandings of its own. People generally are under the impression that the great thing Garcia Marquez discovered was telling about supernatural events in a very normal way, with this poker face, treating supernatural events as if they were natural. Yes, that is part of the great discovery he made about how to talk about our own Latin American world, or rather the Caribbean world. But it's only half of it. Because the other great thing about 100 Years of Solitude is that it treats the natural world, the normal everyday things, as if they were supernatural. This is what we forget. In the first page, in the last page of the first chapter in 100 Years of Solitude, there are 2 events that are next to each other. The character, José Arcadio Buendía, is with his 2 children. He's going to the circus, and he's looking for a friend of him, a gypsy. And he finds this other gypsy and asks him, have you seen Melquiades? And the other gypsy says, Melquiades died. And then he melts down. He becomes this pool of tar, I think, is the English word for that. There's not one single word of astonishment in that scene. That thing that has just happened, a human being melting before your eyes, has nothing surprising for the characters. Doesn't come as a surprise. They don't go looking for, you know, Ghostbusters or whatever. It's normal. But that is just one half of what magical realism is. You turn the page and you get the 2 kids going with their father to the tent of a giant, where he opens up this big box, and there's a block of ice in it. And there you have every single firework, verbal firework, Garcia Marquez was able to display to describe what it is for a child to touch ice for the first time. But it is just frozen water. His astonishment at this, the sense of the supernatural that the characters convey while touching a piece of ice is extraordinary. Now, those two things together are what constitute magical realism. Not just the fantastic part, not just the magical part, but that sense of awe in the face of everyday things. And I have completely lost track of where I was going with this.
Well, I mean, that had informed your own style in a very important way, but I would say that in The Sound of Things Falling, for example, it opens with something that as a non-Latin American reader, as someone who doesn't, who didn't grow up in Colombia, it sounds supernatural to me, this story of these hippos that are on the loose. And I wonder if you wanted to sort of, you wanted to do a reading perhaps of those opening pages, but I mean, it's in a way you don't treat that in some fantastical way with awe at all. It's just presented as part of the bizarre landscape that these characters live in.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
And I'm hoping after this we can also then just turn to the audience for questions that you have for the remaining time.
So this is the, the beginning of the first chapter, the very beginning of the novel. The chapter is called One Single Long Shadow. The first hippopotamus, a male the color of black pearls weighing 1.5 tons, was shot dead in the middle of 2009. He had escaped 2 years before from Pablo Escobar's old zoo in the Magdalena Valley. And during that time of freedom had destroyed crops, invaded drinking troughs, terrified fishermen, and even attacked the breeding bulls at a cattle ranch. The marksman who finally caught up with him shot him once in the head and again in the heart with .375 caliber bullets, since hippopotamus skin is thick. They posed with a dead body, the great, dark, wrinkled mass, a recently fallen meteorite. And there, in front of the first cameras and onlookers, beneath a ceiba tree that protected them from the harsh sun, explained that the weight of the animal would prevent them from transporting him whole, and they immediately began carving him up. I was in my apartment in Bogota, 250 or so kilometers south, when I saw the image for the first time, printed across half a page of a national news magazine. That's how I learned that the entrails had been buried where the animal had fallen, and the head and legs had ended up in a biology laboratory in my city. I also learned that the hippopotamus had not escaped alone. At the time of his flight, he'd been accompanied by his mate and their baby, or what in the sentimental version of the less scrupulous newspapers were his mate and their baby, whose whereabouts were now unknown, and the search for whom immediately took on a flavor of media tragedy, the persecution of innocent creatures by a heartless system. And on one of those days, while following the hunt in the papers, I found myself remembering a man who'd been out of my thoughts for a long while, in spite of the fact that there had been a time when nothing interested me as much as the mystery of his life. During the weeks that followed, the memory of Ricardo Laverde went from being a minor coincidence, one of those dirty tricks our minds play on us, to becoming a faithful and devoted, ever-present ghost, standing by my bed while I slept, watching from afar in the daylight hours. On the morning radio programs and the evening news, in the opinion columns that everybody read and on the blogs that nobody read, everyone was asking if it was necessary to kill the lost hippos if they couldn't round them up, anesthetize them, and send them back to Africa. In my apartment, far from the debate but following it with a mixture of fascination and repugnance, I was thinking more and more intensely about Ricardo Laverde, about the days when we'd known each other, about the brevity of our acquaintance and the longevity of its consequences. While in the press and on the TV screens, the authorities listed the diseases that could be spread by an artiodactyl, and they used that word artiodactyl, new to me. And in the rich neighborhoods of Bogota, people wore t-shirts saying, "Save the hippos." In my apartment, on long drizzly nights or walking down the street toward the city center, I began to think stubbornly about the day Ricardo Laverde died, and even to force myself to remember the precise details. I was surprised by how little effort it took me to summon up the words I had spoken or heard, things I'd seen, pain I'd suffered and now overcome. I was also surprised by the alacrity and dedication we devote to the damaging exercise of remembering, which after all brings nothing good and serves only to hinder our normal functioning, like those bags of sand athletes tie around their calves for training. Bit by bit, I began to notice, not without some astonishment, that the death of that hippopotamus put an end to an episode of my life that had begun quite a while ago, more or less like someone coming back home to close a door carelessly left open. And that's how this story got underway. I don't know what good it does us to remember, what benefits or possible penalties it brings, or how what we've lived through can change when we remember it. But remembering Ricardo Laverde well has become an urgent matter for me. I read somewhere that a man should tell the story of his life at the age of 40, and this deadline is fast approaching. As I write these lines, only a few short weeks remain before this ominous birthday arrives. The story of his life. No, I won't tell my life story, just a few days of it that happened a long time ago, and I'll do so fully aware that this story, as they warn in fairy tales, has happened before and will happen again. That I'm the one who's ended up telling it is almost beside the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it would be great for us to take any questions that members of the audience have, so please feel free to approach either of the mics for questions that you may have.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is the allusion you did to 40 being the age to write your autobiography. I thought that was kind of striking. We usually think of later time maturity, so I wondered what your symbolism was there. I think I get it. And the other is a more general question. How much of an impact has the narco history in Colombia and in South America had in terms of, if you would, permanent influence on the content of literature, you know, compared to earlier times with caudillismo or whatever that marked? I wonder, you know, what's the contrast you see?
Yes, thank you. The allusion to that idea that you should write your autobiography when you're 40 comes from a book by an Uruguayan novelist, Juan Carlos Onetti, whose character in El Pozo, a novel which he published when he was approaching 40, I think, 30-something. I might be mistaken, but his character is approaching 40. And he says everybody should write their autobiography when they're 40. Since the narrator of the novel is slightly older than me, he was turning 40 when he was telling the story, not me. I was 37. I looked at him like somebody old. But this moment in life when you turn 40 has always had a sort of mild interest for me from a literary point of view, because it turns out the two books that made me want to become a writer, 100 Years of Solitude and Joyce's Ulysses, were both published when their authors were 40. So now I'm 42 and I know I will never write a book like that, which is sad in a way, but you know, I keep trying. As for the other question, I have always thought this is an idea that is very much with me, has been very much with me all my life. Times of conflict produce novels. It's a very strange phenomenon. What we call the Latin American boom, the great generation of Latin American writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, their literary father, Jorge Luis Borges, all these people started blooming in the 60s. Why? Why does that happen? My theory is the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution made such an impact in our consciences, in the way politics worked, in the way individuals related themselves to politics. It was just an earthquake in Latin American conscience that produced a generation of novelists. Why do Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Gogol turn up at the very same time in Russia? Because there's a whole system of life, Tsarism, about to fall. So moments in which countries are about to experience great change or are experiencing great change produce literature. Because literature is the way we have discovered to ask the most difficult questions. I think this is what the drug wars did for us. They were such a transformation in such a short time. The drug cartels weren't born until the early 80s. Drug dealing in earnest, coming from Latin America, began in 1970. So I was born in 1973, so I'm part of the generation that was born at the same time as the drug wars. And I saw my country fall and be completely transformed, and I saw the whole of my world go to pieces and be replaced by something else. A different aesthetic, a different way of looking at the world, a different set of values. So it's, in a way, it's almost predictable that a bunch of novelists would start writing about those things obsessively, because they are asking the questions. We need to know what happened there. I don't know if in any way I answered your question, but
you have, and,
okay.
It opens a whole bunch of others, but I'll let somebody else answer.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I remember I was reading Álvaro Cepeda in La Casa Grande, the big house. He talked or wrote about the same topic you were talking about, facing criticism for not writing about Colombia in a very critical time, like he also faced. And yes. Considering that situation and what you've told us about this issue, which would be like your next interests for writing more, or your new books? Which would be their topics right now? I mean, are they, or would they be focused on Colombian issues, or maybe a different topic?
Well, right now, a couple of years ago, I published a new novel, a short novel that will come out in English in America next June. In a way, it's a story that could have been said anywhere else. It's the story of a political cartoonist who gets into trouble for drawing a cartoon. This was months before what happened in France. But the book I have just finished now, a week ago, I'm still recovering from that 500-page novel. It's about two political murders that have shaped the history of my country. One of them is kind of our own JFK, if you will. That ongoing mystery everybody has a theory about. So, in a way, my answer would be, I don't choose my subjects. I don't let it sound too esoteric, because it's not, but I don't choose my subjects. My subjects choose me. Because I write about the things that I don't understand. I write about the things that surprise me. And I have realized over the years that this is one of the other big lies in writing courses, that writers write about their own places because those are the places they know. So Joyce writes about Dublin because he knows Dublin so well. and Philip Roth writes about New Jersey because he knows it so well. I think that's a lie. I think we write about the places we grew up with because those are the places we thought we knew until something happens and we realize we have absolutely no idea what is going on there. You meet somebody who tells you a story. For instance, I met this lady once in Colombia, and she told me that an hour from where I lived, the Colombian government had set up prisoner camps for Nazi and fascist sympathizers during the Second World War. This happened an hour from my place. I never knew about it. So how can the place I thought I knew be so surprising, so unsettling? This is what I write about. So in a way, I think I will, for better or worse, continue writing about Colombia because this is the only place I thought I knew, and it turns out I don't know it at all. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Joseph Conrad, the Secret History of Costaguana. Well, just specifically, I mean, you know, clearly the person you write as in that book starts out with a great admiration for the man, for the author, and ends up considering him sort of like a cultural thief. Mm-hmm. So where are you on that? How did you get there, and how is Joseph Conrad sort of affected?
Yes.
Your outlook on those
yeah.
issues.
Well, the gentleman is discussing The Secret History of Costaguana, which is my second novel, my second official novel. Now you all know the secret that I destroyed 2 novels before that, but my second official novel that I am sort of proud about is a story in which a narrator tells his life story to Joseph Conrad, and then sees that he has turned it into a novel called Nostromo, an actual novel that Joseph Conrad published in 1904. So my narrator absolutely hates Conrad. He feels he has been cheated out of his life, out of his experience, and that the most important things that have happened to him have been turned into a novel in which the country is not even Colombia, but some fictitious place called Costaguana. So he's very annoyed, and the novel is his attempt at getting his story back. You obviously know that narrators don't always think what authors think. In this case, I couldn't agree less with the concept my narrator has of Joseph Conrad. But the novel became this laboratory to explore important ideas for me, such as who has the right to tell our story. As human beings, we are always telling the story of our lives and societies, and this is what will eventually become history. So we have to be very serious about who we give that right to, the right to impose a version of our own story. Because there are these powers all the time that are competing for the right to tell our own story. The state, the government, religion is always very keen to impose their version of history to the rest of us. I think literature is the place where individual citizens raise their hands and say, hey, I don't agree with that version of history. I will tell you my own version of what happened here. So this is one of the things I wanted to discuss in that novel. But Joseph Conrad, for me personally, has been one of the great influences in my work. I think his influence is both from a formal point of view, just the way his stories are told by somebody who tells what somebody told them. And so they put us in a very uncertain place. We never know what's true in them. They convey this sense of unreliable story, right? And I find that fascinating. And also, from a philosophical point of view, if you will, the idea of the reasons why we read and write. I'm absolutely convinced of his position on this. I think we read and write fiction to go to dark places where invisible, mysterious things are happening, and we have absolutely no clue how they will affect us. Among other, these are the places we call history and politics. Big forces that are shaping our lives, and we don't know how that is going on. I read novels and I write novels to go to those dark places and try to bring back the news, as I said before. This is a lesson I learned from novels such as Heart of Darkness, for instance.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm very interested in your novels, how you explore the role of memory
Yes.
and of remembering, and what we remember as individuals and the collective memory of a nation. And I'm reading your late Las Reputaciones, and this character that thinks he has witnessed something
Yes.
that gives place to a whole, to an incident that might or might not be true, but
Yes.
has consequences. And I'm interested in this if we transfer it to the history of Latin America and the possibility of reconciliation when our memories are not, when there's so much doubt about what it is that when there is no consensus.
Yes, yes. I think your question is much more interesting than my answer. But I'll do my best. I absolutely agree with you, with everything you've said. And I think what I have attempted to do in every one of my novels is to try to explore that mysterious relationship we have with the past, which we can only know through memory. And memory is unreliable. Memory is being shaped constantly by politics and by people in power. They try to shape the way we recall things. So my three novels, The Informers, The Secret History of Costaguana, and The Sound of Things Falling, deal with the idea of remembering our individual past in the places it becomes our collective past. The idea of remembering something that happened to the country many years ago that in some way shapes our lives. This is what they try to do. But in the novel you were writing, for the first time I do the same thing only at a private level, at an intimate level. This character, the cartoonist, once draw a cartoon of somebody because he thought he saw something. As years go by, he starts to doubt that that was exactly what he saw. So what happens then? What happens if you took a big step in your life that made a huge impact in somebody else's life, and you do it out of a mistaken perception because you think you remember something, but that something maybe didn't happen at all? What happens in your life? This is the main question that I try to explore in the new novel, Reputations, I think it will be called. These things obsess me. Maybe it comes from the moment in which I realized that despite what everybody tells us, the past is not fixed. As Faulkner said this in a great novel that I love, Requiem for a Nun. He said, the past is not dead, it's not even past, meaning it stays with us. We all carry our own past with us. The consequences of the past stay with us and are active and are shaping our lives right now. I could also quote a bolero, I think, that says, lo que pasó, pasó. Great philosophy in just a couple of lines. Lo que pasó, pasó. That what happened, happened. Well, that's not true. What happened is still with us, and it can change. It can change. You discover a picture, somebody tells you a story, you accidentally run into a letter, and your past begins to change. Your parents become somebody else. Your couple, your spouse becomes somebody else. Your friends become somebody else. So this idea that the past is not fixed is just terrifying for me. And I think I'm writing to try to come to terms with it.
Unfortunately, we've run out of our time, but I hope you can...
Yeah, I'll make it very quick.
Okay.
I mean, just at the beginning, you said that the task of a novelist is to take you to places. You've succeeded because you're from Colombia and I'm from India, and I'm reading your book right now, The Informers, and I cannot put it down.
Thank you.
If you can tell, I mean, is it just based on research or some of it is personal experience?
None of my books are solely based on research. They all come from a more or less direct experience. In that case, it was meeting the real version of Sarah Guterman, the character you're reading about. Her real version is a lady that I met in 1999, a German Jewish lady who came to Colombia in 1938, and who told me about these prison camps. She was Jewish, and her father, who was also Jewish, obviously, was almost thrown into one of these camps, despite the fact that he was Jewish and had escaped Hitler. He was accused of being a Nazi only because he was German. He had a German passport and he spoke German, which was highly suspicious at the time. So that whole paradox of history made me want to know her whole life. And I
don't want to hear anymore.
So I won't tell you she dies at the end.
Well, Amanda, we appreciated everything that you shared with us. So thank you so much for taking the time to be in Washington.
Thank you, Bilal. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.